of these Friday news briefings. Domestic violence is the oldest and most pervasive form of violence in the world, says author, essayist, and activist Angela Davis. It's long been accepted as just an inevitable part of the complex fabric of family relationships across all cultures, including mainstream American culture. Today, a growing movement to break that mindset is emerging, even as data reveal that the rate of domestic violence has not fallen. 1 out of 3 women and 1 in 6 men in the U.S. have experienced domestic violence at some point in their lifetimes. The most dramatic indicator of progress, however, says Davis, is that when she was growing up, there was silence about this issue based on the assumption that nothing could be done. 50 years later, there's a public commitment to end domestic or gender-based violence for good. That, she suggests, represents a sea change. Speakers today will focus on efforts to find solutions through legislation, reforms in the judicial system, and grassroots mobilizing through social media by survivors of abuse themselves. Our speakers include video remarks by Angela Davis, who is a distinguished professor emeritus at UC Santa Cruz. She's an author and, of course, a veteran activist. California State Senator Susan Rubio, a Democrat from Baldwin Park. Tina Swithin, the founder of One Woman's Battle, and Vijay Sundaram, a reporter for the San Francisco Public Press, and the co-founder of Narika, a nonprofit advocacy group working with South Asian American women. We asked speakers to speak slowly for our interpreters in Spanish, Mandarin, and Korean, and we asked reporters to enter their questions in the chat box, which we will address following each speaker as time allows. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later on today. So now we begin today with a short video excerpt of remarks made by Angela Davis, who delivered last week at a conference on domestic violence sponsored by Blue Shield California Foundation and the Black Freedom Fund. Jessica, may I please ask you to run Angela Davis's remarks? Thank you.
When I first became aware of domestic violence, gender violence, as a political issue in the 1970s, with the speak outs and all of the kind of feminist formations that were occurring at that time, the first question that was tackled was the question of silence. How we're talking about a form of violence that has been in most human societies for hundreds of years. And we also learn how to hide it. Because somehow it's represented as the problem of the survivor. I wrote a book some years ago called Blues Legacies and Black Feminism. And one of the reasons I wrote that book was because in listening to Black women blues singers, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and so forth, Ida Cox, Rosa Henderson, and so forth, I noticed that many of them sang about violence. They sang about what was happening to them in their relationships. I wanted us to have a sense of how long it often takes for these ideas to make a difference. And of course, we want to see immediate change. We're gathered here today discussing an issue which first became a part of public discourse over 50 years ago. And as a matter of fact, this is the most widespread pandemic form of violence in the world. And with all of the actions that have happened, with all of the, domestic violence centers and rape crisis centers and so forth, the actual incidence of violence has not changed very much. When I think back to my own childhood and the lack of a capacity to understand that, something needed to be done and something could be done. I mean, I'm, very fortunate in my family, immediate family. We did not have direct experiences, but I can remember many stories, friends and relatives, and I can remember at that time just feeling absolutely incapable of doing anything, because the discourse, the available discourse, was that this was just a natural phenomenon. This was just something that existed, and nothing could really be done about it except to find solutions involving escape, but not changing the frame, not challenging whether violence was necessarily a part of human relationships. And when I compare that period to today, we have made a progress that would have been unimaginable, that I don't know whether I've ever experienced a moment when vast numbers of people were so politically engaged, when vast numbers of people were so concerned about the future of our planet, concerned about the climate, concerned about war, concerned about ending racism. And so that's very different from, this is a period unlike any other in the history of this country. We're making progress. I feel very hopeful. Well,
that was so powerful. Many thanks to the Blue Shield Foundation of California and the Black Freedom Fund for making Ms. Davis's remarks available to us. We now
ko tui pe ho ik me kai nga ko lea mari na lea e fine ko ni fekau aki pe amo e whakamamahi ko ia I api o ku kawa ia e fehu I ko ni ko to tafu ko ni to taha ki loa I ene ngai ngā aue tau te fito ki ene ngai ngā aue ko ia ke whaka ke ta ofi ai whakamamahi api pe ko domestic violence. Ia taim te tau na ane pehe ko fehu I koe, ia taim te tau whekau ak mo mea ko ni o tau fehu ia ai silence, pe koe whakalongolongo ia palopale ma ko ia. Toko lahe kakai o nau mo ua pe oku wesia ki nau tolu he domestic violence I api ko hono palopale ma ko ene whakalongolongo. Pe ko tui o ku whatatau eni ki anga e tau culture a tau tolu ho ik mo e ka inga o gune o mai e whakakaukau tatau. Kai ke uloto au ke ulea o whekau aki pea moe whamamahi o kui api te ria na mau hakuluma, he kei whanongo mai a tahaia te nau tuku aki I pe nau tolu au. Ngahi mea pe he te ne lava ia o whaka ai kita ke te whakalongolongo. Kai ke te fierea kita ki hono whamamahi ki tau tolu I api. Pea kune toi pehe whoki koe hanai hono loa ke tau make a difference. Koe ha hono loa ke tau whai hali liu koe uhi ke ta ofi e whamamahi I api. Pena ne pehe whoki I ene tūpu hake o kune whakatoka ngā iai I kai ke iai hatawiwi malawa ke tau whainga ke ta ofi ai whakamamahi ko ia I api pea I he taim te tau whoki o kuia ene ko maamani Amerikani lahe ngai concern pe ko ngai ho ha Afrika mo feliuli wake ea lahe ngai ho ha Afrika mo ngai tau o fai fe mo lahe ngai ho ha Afrika mo tunga fa ekonomika ka u te kei ke highlight ia I Amerikani mo ngai whanua mamani ai ho ha a ko ia ke tokanga I ai kakai o kunau o whakamamahi I api pe o kunau ao pe mo domestic violence. Ko lea hono hoko te tau wakaya I ke lea ai whewhine ko niko senatoa. Aia ko Senatoa Susan Rubio, aia na filia I California Legislature I wafe tahavaluke ne represent Senate District Ward 1. Na ne hoko fuko whaiako e tau e tahafitu I Baldwin Park mo Monrovia School District pe kai ngata ika na whili ia ke ne hoko ko ka ofisiale e tau e tahataha ke city ko ia o Baldwin Park. Ko e fuafua Latino eni ke ne sea I he komiti ko ia o Senate Insurance ko ia e tuku ke tau wakai ki he ene lave whekau aki pea moe whakamamahi ko ia I api.
14, which is the HELP Act. And that bill was
of our
to us. We now move on to California State Senator Susan Rubio, who has authored a number of bills addressing domestic violence, including the HELP Act. Senator Rubio, welcome. Senator Rubio?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Absolutely. Will you begin?
Oh, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. Anyone that knows my work knows that I focus a great deal of my time and energy and policies on domestic violence issues, in particular because I'm a survivor of domestic violence. And since I started in 2018, I've made it my mission, one step at a time. The legislature moves very slowly. However, we have a good group of people that believe in keeping families safe. And I see some of my allies on this Zoom call. One of the bills that I did help pass was SB 914, which is the HELP Act. And that bill was primarily focused on tackling domestic violence victims that end up on the streets because of their circumstance. But often they're overlooked. They're not given the resources that they need. And so when we think of a victim with children, they're having to make a choice whether they leave the relationship and end up on the street homeless with their children, or stay in that relationship and be abused and battered. So that wasn't a real choice. And many victims, some that I spoke with, shared that they understand that when they go to shelters, they only allow them to stay 30 to 45 days, and then they're out on the street again. So for them, thinking long term, they really have to take it in and say, do I want to be homeless or do I want to stay in this abusive relationship? There is no middle ground or a solution. So with the HELP Act, now we're requiring that we call them unaccompanied women. These are women who leave a relationship and end up on the street, but they don't get priority. For example, sometimes if there's families out on the street with children, they get taken in before someone that's single. Some reported up to being on the street up to 10 years before they got helped. And that is just unacceptable. I think everyone has the right to be housed and feel safe. And so now any continuum of care that receives state funding is required to have a gender equity lens, if you will. We want them to specifically be able to create policy and gather data that really focuses on domestic violence victims and this vulnerable population, and have clear outline goals. We want to see goals set and be measured and tracked to make sure that we're being successful with this policy. Besides this bill, I have about 25 bills that I've authored in this space, but another bill that I'm focusing right now, in 2019, when I started, I passed the Phoenix Act, which extended the statute of limitations for victims of domestic violence. It had not been touched in 30 years. So victims had 3 years to come forward and seek justice or get help. And many victims go up to 8, 9, 10 years with post-traumatic stress. They're not able to help themselves because of the trauma that they endured. And for the state to mandate that they come forward in 3 years was unacceptable. So I set out to change that and make it 15 years. Unfortunately, they reduced it, meaning through the committee hearings, we finally passed it with 5 years. So we gave victims 2 more years to get support. This year, I had the bill that would extend it to 15 years. It did not die. It passed every single committee, but it was held in appropriations till January. So hopefully we'll get that done as well. And there's so many other policies, but I know that time is limited. So I'll turn it over to you if you have any questions. I see Tina on this call recently, about 15 days ago, the governor signed Peaky's Law, which is very important to a lot of mothers. And I believe she will probably speak on it. But this is also taking into consideration that judges sometimes are uninformed. Perhaps they don't have the experience that it's required to really make an informed decision. Peaky's Law is named after a 5-year-old little boy who was murdered by his father. During separation, of course, he was angry and he wanted to get back at his mom, which is Anna Esteves, and suffocated the little boy. The mother tried to no avail to try and get full custody of this child who was verbalizing that he was scared, he was being abused, and no one would listen. Sure enough, he ended up being suffocated by that parent. The judge that ruled in that case had spent 30 years in corporate law. He had just been appointed to family law, didn't really understand what the signs were, what are the patterns of abuse. Even reading those perpetrators that sometimes the signs are obvious, but you need to know how to read them. So Peaky's Law will now help educate judges to ensure that they're studying domestic violence cases and child custody cases. Again, it's about just giving them the tools to make sure that they're making better decisions. So thank you so much for this time, and I'll turn it over to you if you have any questions.
Yeah, I see a number of questions coming through, but Senator
ko ta fo ke le ko ne senator ko ni hoi mo kainga ne kauia I ngahi fa o ngahi lao o fo tu ke whakapasi pe na pasi ngahi lao ni pe I he time ta fo ki na ne talano ai o pehe na ia e keisi ta ko keisi ko ni ko haongo matu a pe na no fo ki tamasi I pe mo hono pe mo ene tamai pe na ne hanga o fu whamamahi I tamasi ko ni. Ye whenga e whae koe ke ne hopo I ai custody ko ia o ki tamasi I, nei kai ke tālia e he loi, e whamau. Koe whakamau koe ni, na e whamau ia, pina e hoko e koe whakamau I he corporate law, I he tau e hongo fulu toki aluhifo pe ia whakamau ki he family law, I he ngahi recently. Pia na ne whai anu whakamau e hopo koe ni kumi custody e o whewhine ne hono whoha. Ko mea koe ne hoko, ne nofo e pe whoha pa mo e tamai koe ni, pena I ku tamate pe whakapongu whawhatapu e he tamai a koe ni a hono whoha. O wakaya e talanoa koe e whewhine koe ni, pe ko senatoa koe ni, ki he tuunga koe o kuiai ai lao pe I he whonuani. Ko taimini o kuikai ke lelei ai system koe ai family laws, ke nau I loi mo whakamahino I mo mahino ai tuunga o kuiai ai whakamamahi I api. O hange koe whakamahau koe ni na ne whakamahau ai keisi koe ni. I taim te tau o kune pehe, ko e tokolahi ai kakai fefine o kunau end up o homeless pe nofo i he ve e hala pe mo e nau whanau ko uhiko domestic violence pe ko whamamahi api he ko nau whiri o kuape ko nau nofo pe i api ke hoko te pe hono whakamamahi i ki nau tolu pe ko nau woa ki hala pe mo e nau whanau o nofo i he ve e hala pe ko homeless pe ulahi au pita ngai keisi au si o kune wakai kia i temi tau foki o kune pehe o gai toko lahi o nau o mai o nau homeless ko hinga nau hola mei api ko hui ko whamamahi api nau o homeless pe na nau pehe ko tau ene hongo fulu e nau homelessi ko toki mau eni ha tokoni ka tek nau tol fuo loa au pito a e nau si i homelessi tok whakatoka nga i he pure anga ai mea koe o koko petok o ange ene tokoni tola pito kakai fefine mo kakai o nau tuu o pehe ai tuku nga kakai ni i nau huki tu amo e nau whanau nau o ki a shelter pe ko atu ko ki shelter whakafofua ko aho pe whani ma te nau i shelter ai pe toi tukuange mai ki nau tolu ia tau mai ako shelter ke nofu ai forever ko iai o kupehe ko ia e fefine ko ni ko tukuange mai ko ki nau tolu nau toi foki pe ki square one ki hono whakamamahi i ko ia oe kakaini pe ko ia tupe ke tau toi wakai ke ngai whihui pe a moe tari ko ia i he whakaeke ko ia oe senatoa.
You said at the top of the call that you came to this from your own personal experience, and I wonder if you could please share a bit of your own personal experience that makes you an advocate for domestic violence.
Yes. Well, first of all, the misconception is, as I had that misconception, so I will be the first to admit that we tend to think that domestic violence happens to women or men. We know it happens to men as well. We tend to think that those that have higher degrees, perhaps are educated, have experience with the system, will not fall victims to domestic violence. I was a local council member. I have a bachelor's, a master's. I was a teacher, everything that you would need to recognize the signs, to perhaps prevent yourself from falling victim to domestic violence, but it happened to me. So what I learned through my experience is that there are no barriers. It can happen to anyone. It doesn't matter who you are. But now, as I'm interviewing women, which I do all the time, I'm finding more and more that it seems like it's happening to a lot of professional women because perpetrators know how important their reputation is, know how important the career is. So they spend a lot of time threatening the victims, either going to the media, going public with it. What happened to me was that I also suppressed it. I didn't want to share because I was a local elected official. I knew that the story would be all over the newspaper, which it did. The LA Times followed my case and was reporting on things that are extremely embarrassing for a victim. You're already a victim. And now you're going to, you deal with the public scrutiny. I still hear things like, it didn't happen. Why didn't she leave? But that's common. And what we want to do is change that narrative. It is not up to any of us to decide when a victim should leave. That is why I wanted to extend the statute of limitations. There are at least 5 mothers that I know who left the situation under the 5 years that we're requiring them to come forward, and their children ended up murdered. So when victims are dealing with the circumstance, they need to make sure they're safe. They need to make sure their children are safe, and they need to make sure they have the support system to be able to walk away in a safe manner. We do know that statistically, the danger of being harmed or murdered happens after separation. And so for me, it was the fear of going public, the fear of everyone knowing. I did not want to disappoint my parents. I never told my family. So we're dealing with a lot of issues that we're having to contend with. So it's not an easy thing. So after my case and my story broke, hundreds of women reached out to me through social media, email. I became somewhat of a diary for all these women. And I knew there was a calling. I knew that I was placed in this position to do something about it. And through their experience and some of my own experience, I've been able to tackle issues one by one as the years progress. And so I've already authored or been partners with about 25 bills in the legislature.
Na eke foki he whai o ngongo ki he senatoa. Ko senatoa foki he whewhine koe ni. Ko e uhinga foki ne ngā ue pe hoko ko advocate o e domestic violence pe ko whamamahi api he na e osi hoko ia ki ai. Pe ko eke ko ia e tota whai o ngongo pe ko hae na mea na e hoko. Ko hae ai whamamahi api na e hoko ki ai. Ko ne tāri ko e ki ai a senatoa Rubio na ane pe he ko e domestic violence o ku hoko pe ki he kakai tatau ai pe ko high level o ku te ai. Ko ia, os maa hono matai tohi bachelor, maa hono matai tohi master, ne hoko ko e tahaya ko sirio honau ko lo, ko hoko e ko e whaiako. Kana e hoko ki ai e whamamahi ai api. Nā ne pehe foki ko taim ko na e hoko e whamamahi ko i api ki ai, pe ko domestic violence ki ai, nā ke loto ia ke lea pe loto ke tala, pe loto ke lipoti, ko huinga haku ne ilo, e mau hono ngongo, e ave he media, e mea ko hoko, ilo he neongo mātua, he na teke ke ne tala ia ki he neongo mātua, e mea ko ia na e hoko, pe si mau hono a ngongo o naia. He wau pe ke taimino ku kei tala pe kakai toko lahia, na ke hoko ha mea ia ki ai. Ka neongo ia. Ko mena e hoko, na en apu pe o alu kotoa ai ngahi whamamahi api na e hoko ki ai i he media. Taim kona ne whaia e lipoti na e hoko lewa a hono ave media ko talanoa i he kakai toko lahi ai whamamahi na e hoko ki ai pea ika e ngata ika na e hoko ai fo i talanoa ia muen ave takai ngai talanoa ko ia ke toe mamahi ange ia ai i he domestic violence ko na e hoko ki ai. Ko alu ko hono ngongo ona o ku toe whai ngata ange ki ai ke cope pe moia i he fo i domestic violence ne hoko ki ai. Nāne pehe. Ko whai ngata ako o ku toe whai ngata ange ai taimia koe o mawahe ai pe mi api pe o kuna taktama anai ko uhi kono whamamahi. Ko whai taimi koe o hoko ai koe domestic violence pe kono whamamahi ai api whakawhihanaki ki taimi koe o kuna taktama anai pe o mawahe ai koe me he nofo family o kune pe o mamahi ange ai whai ngata aia pe o whai ngata ange ai whai taimia koe o e separation. Ko e ne tāria ko ia ki e whehui ai tō taha koe ni whai o ngongo. Kai tupe tau hoko atu.
Thank you. We have a number of questions. The first from Henrietta Burrows. Henrietta, would you please ask your question?
Yes, thanks so much, Sunita. You have basically answered my question, why it might take a victim 15 years to come forward. So I would like to ask you now, what about the perpetrators? Are they being convicted? Are they being sentenced? What's going on with their being brought to justice?
Well, the reason this was very important to me is, I'm going to share one particular case. What happened with one particular victim, she was not necessarily hit physically, and I'll share my domestic violence course of control bill and why I passed it. It was based on this particular woman who was not physically being harmed, but her perpetrator tied her up for 4 days, was depriving her of food and sleep, and really she was delirious after 4 days or so. And she ended up having post-traumatic stress for so many years that she didn't come forward. She came forward after she knew that other victims were being already abused. And I say this because this woman had audio, video, text messages, everything you would want to convict a perpetrator. And because the statute of limitation had expired after 3 years, she was no longer able to seek justice. And the evidence was very clear. And this woman was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. That's why I wanted to change it to 15 years to give victims that time. When you ask me about perpetrators, the reality is that most victims run into these barriers. They're not able to report on time. Trying to gather the information when you're a victim, the evidence when you're a victim is very difficult. Even as they acquire evidence, they run into the possibility of the perpetrator finding out and harming them even more. So they are being brought to justice. It depends on the circumstance, but a lot of victims are missing the mark, meaning they're not coming forward with enough time. And that is why it's so important that we passed the bill that was held this year. It would change the law from 5 years to 15 years. And hopefully we do hold these perpetrators accountable.
Thank you. Our next question comes from
ko feo ifok ne at mi taha ka fa ngongo ko e taimini o ku fa atuai ai a hono lipoti ko ia e ka victim ai fa mamahi ai api pe agua ai lao o pehe ka pau te lipoti a hono fa mamahi kita ai api e ose ta o nima pe me hono fa mamahi kita ai api pe ga ileva ke take ia e pure anga a e te launga ko ia o hange ko fefine ko ni whamatala na e whamamahi ai api a hai e hono hoa ia pe ikai ki anga ne me akai mga he mea ko toa ko ia i he fo i kakato e wha pe ne mawahe ko ia na e hoko fo incident ia ko ia ke stress ia pe palpale mai ne whakakaukau ko uhi ko mea ko ne hoko ne o se ta uia nima pe ne toksio ke kakai fefine ko na lipoti ko ia a mea na hoko ka na tolu pe ne tok whakakaukau ai ke foki ke lipoti e mea ko taim ko ne alata lipoti ko talange ia ko o se ta ue nima ia a mea ko ia ne hoko pe kai ke toi lava ia whakamau ia i lao ko he taimini pe ko tuko taimini o ko ia e lao o fotu e fefine ko ni se na toa ko ni ke whakaloloa me ta ue nima ke ta e tahanima aia ko na tol ko to te ne lava lipoti hano whakamamahi i api i loto e tahanima o gua e lao e lava ke whakamau i to tako ia.
Pilar Marrero. Pilar.
Okay, I wasn't able to mute before. Thank you so much, Senator. I can't tell you how personally I feel this because there's no woman friend that I ask or talk with about this that doesn't have not one, but many stories. You know, I grew up in Latin America. I don't know how the experience is here, but growing up in Latin America, I saw everything I had to see on the street. I had everything touched that I had to be touched on the street. And a lot of women experience plenty of sexual violence growing up, both physical and psychological. When I arrived in the States, I was sexually harassed in a job. I mean, it's nonstop. It goes on and on. What is it that we need to do? And I don't think that's in the past. I think it's happening nowadays. This is beyond domestic violence. It happens everywhere to women, mostly to women. What is needed in this society in order to attack this larger problem that leads to women being so vulnerable everywhere they are to this kind of toxicity and poison?
Well, I think it boils down to education. A lot of victims don't know that there's help. What I hear a lot is immigrant women being threatened with their status, immigration status. And so if we have information to hand to them, that's why these forums are very critical to get the information out. Victims that perhaps don't have proper documentation don't know that if they come forward, there is help and that they will be protective. There are U visas where if you're a victim of domestic violence, you can stay in this country and be protected. So it's lack of information because we are changing laws little by little, but victims still don't know. So I passed SB 1141, which changed the definition of domestic violence to include coercive control. As I shared that story about the victim that was tied up, she really couldn't say that she was assaulted, but the psychological torture and trauma this woman endured caused her to have post-traumatic stress for 8 years, but yet it wasn't recognized in the courts. So my SB 1141 now allows victims to use coercive control as supporting evidence in court. So if someone is withholding basic necessities like food, shelter, these needs that you need to survive, or finances, taking your check away every week, or taking your phone away, reading your text messages, all of this in accumulation is now they're able to take it to court and use it as supporting evidence. So when you ask me, what do we need to do, is make sure that victims know what's out there, because we are doing a lot a lot of work. Now, it's not enough. The work will continue, and this is an ongoing battle, and it'll continue for many years to come. But if we can at least share with some of the victims what's out there, I think that they would feel more confident to come forward. And I also believe we have to tackle the issue on the other side, which is generational trauma. Perpetrators are abusing victims because they probably were victims of abuse themselves in the home or outside the home. But if we tackle that generational trauma, that's one way to help, but it has to start from when they're young. And so talking to our children, our young ones about what domestic violence is, it's really helpful. I do that often in schools. I've been a teacher for 20 years. One of the first bills I passed was adding the hotline, the domestic violence hotline in the back of ID cards, because I understood that perhaps children are experiencing violence in the home and they don't have anyone to call. So from 7th grade to higher education, if they turn the ID card around, they have a number they can call and get help or at least have some questions answered. So again, education little by little, making sure the victims know what's out there.
Na feo I foki he whaiongongo koe ni ki senatoa pe koe hanai mea whai ko ia personally e tō tako ia journalist koe ni na I Latin America, tupake Latin America, pe ne apiusia pe na e whamamahi ia I he ngai wheitu keke. I kai pe ngata no whamamahi I hono sinoka ka whamamahi I whakaatamai. Ko ne hako ki Amerikani, ko mea tatau. Ai mea koe hono wesia ia e whamamahi o a upe foki na e sexual assault ia I api ngawe. Pa koe ne whehu I. Koe hanai mea to ton ke tau whai. He koe palpalema koe ni e whamamahi api uk alu ke toi lahi yange. Pea o hoko ia o koe peke hantai me tau whiai. Koe tali koe senatoana ne pehe a koi. O fie mao ia ke a koi ho tau kakai. Ke a koi ho tau kakai. Ke nau ilo ai whamamahi I api. Pe kai ngatai. O maho inga ke nau ilo ai lao ko ia ki he whamamahi api. He ko taime ni koe ke tau ilo e tau tolo e lao tene lava o toko ni I kita I he taime koe au whamamahi ia kita I api. Hange koe ne talano a koe ni na e whai o ku maho inga ia ke educate pia kamata pe mei api. Hono a koe e tau whanau. A koe e tau whanau ke nau ilo ko whe a taime koe whamamahi ia. He o wikai ke ngata pe I ono whamamahi ko ano tai, e lava pe ke kawat mo whamamahi ko api, ko kai ki o angane mea kai, pe ko ane inu, ngai basic needs ko ia, kai ki o angano wala maafana, o ku kau pe mo ia, I he domestic violence. Pe kai ngatai, ka kune pe a ko I ki nau tolu ke nau ilo, te nau lava ngawe aki ai ngahi audio, ngai text, fe text aki, ko ngahi video, ko ngahi fe tohi aki, hawhai ngā whaunga pe, I meiri pe ko hafua e lava ke nau ngawe aki a koe evidence e taimi koe te nau hangai o lipoti ha whakamamahi na whakahoko ka kita I api ai a koe mea maho inga pe koe tari maho inga koe e senatoana ne pehe o maho inga ia ke educate e tau kakai pe a koe mo e tau whanau ke nau ilo a domestic violence pe a mo e ngai lao e lava ke ne hawhaki I kita mei he domestic violence Koia tu ke tau hoko atai pepe mo e tau prokalama I hono whakaike koia o Senator Rubio.
Thank you. We have 2 more questions. Do you have time?
Probably one more.
Okay, so let me ask Renee Barbie to ask her question. Renee.
So on. And
Renee, are you still there? All right, then Mira Kaimal, will you please ask your question?
Read it.
Okay, I will ask Mira's question for her. Rubio?
Well, going to the police can be a very intimidating undertaking. I know it personally; it is the scariest thing to call the police, and especially if you're in a dangerous situation. So, I think for these immigrant women, I would recommend to go to a domestic violence advocate, domestic violence shelter, just to seek guidance, because you need someone at your side guiding you through the process, making sure that they help you navigate the legal system. I've been through the legal system. There's so many challenges and so many barriers, even to someone as, highly, I would say, considering I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, should have been something that I could have navigated so easily. But there's so many roadblocks, and not just because, someone's status or education. It's just the way the court system is set up. There's so many roadblocks. So they need to go to a shelter, to an advocate, a trusted friend. They just need someone by their side to help them navigate this. It's a scary thing to go through by themselves, especially undocumented. And what I fear is that, again, if they're doing it alone, there's danger of their perpetrators finding out and harming them. So I would encourage them to seek help with the shelter.
Absolutely. Final question. I promise.
Ko tuin ko tahan na fehu mahu inga na fehu iko ni. Whika again mo kakai fefine pe ko kakai oku wesia e famamahi I api ka utikege mau na pepa pe now undocumented. O pe he to ta ko ni o mo saibe al ke ka polisi ka ko ene fale iko ki ata o ke mau ene pepa pe undocumented ka pau o famamahi I api pe aluia ki ngai domestic violence center. Kono uhinga he toko ni he domestic violence center ai toko tahani pe koe kau immigrants koe ni ki he ngahi a hala koe au totonge nau fowai. He ko taimi koe o wikai ke aha toko ni pe he koe fu court system ia koe Amerikani I kai ngata pe he ne fihi ka ulahi au pito e ngahi road block ia tene poloka eia aia koe uhinga koe teke ke mau ene pepa. Aia ko ne fale I koe o whai koe ia kia taha o tike ke mao ne pepaka o koe si aia e domestic violence kumi e koe ha domestic violence center because center koe ne toka ngai kina domestic violence koe uhinga ke tokoni at ka koe ke mofononga whakataha koe ngā ka awa tu koe ki ha road block pe koe poloka koe whakamau anga te nau ia I ke nau tokoni I koe.
You said at the top of your remarks that, the Los Angeles Times covered your case and handled it pretty poorly, exposing elements of your story that should not have been out there. We are all reporters here. And I wonder if you could leave us by answering the question of how we report on domestic violence issues in a manner that is fair to the victim.
Well, one of the things I would add, when my abuser was sharing that the bruises came from me harming myself, I think it's just reading between the lines. We had plenty of evidence, photographs, witness testimony. By way of example, the police did go to my house and we had the chief testifying, but of course, trying to put blame on me, he stated that I was harming myself, that I was crazy, that I was banging my head on the steering wheel. That's how I got the bruises. And that was reported. So, as a victim, I would say that particular statement was so harmful, saying, I won't say his name, but the person stated that she's crazy and that she was banging herself on the steering wheel. I think that printing that just sort of perpetuated what he was saying. He was saying I was crazy, and by printing that just added fuel to the fire of some of the harm that was done to me in terms of other people not believing me. You're in a very vulnerable state, so I think I would just say be careful what you print. If there's a victim, in this case I was the victim seeking justice, we don't want to give voice to that perpetrator that's trying to diminish your credibility, trying to make you out to look crazy. I know it's very sensitive, and as a media, you have to find that middle ground. But reporting what's happening was fair play, day by day. But saying that I was crazy and that he reported that I was banging myself in the steering wheel was the most humiliating and embarrassing thing I had to endure during that trial. So during my case, I'm sorry, it wasn't a trial, but being sensitive to the victim and being careful not to give voice to the perpetrator trying to embarrass the victim.
Senator Rubio, thank you so much for joining us today. We very much welcome your remarks.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. I have to excuse myself and have a
Ko duga fe fa o si fe ka ak me taim ko ya kulipoti ai e ka whaiongongo ai domestic violence pe ko fe ho I ko hana fo ngau to ton ke na fa ko tali ko ya sina toana ne pe he o fe ma o ya ke tau fu to kanga au pito taim o tau lipoti ai ha domestic violence ke oa e to e sia nge ai a victim pe ko to ta ko ya o whakalavea pe hoko pe ko hoko e te hanga kita o lipoti a media ke ne to o ange e ha whainga maari o to lahi ange ke to tahana ne whai e whakalavea ke hao ia pe me case ko hange pe ko ne case ana na hoko a me ko ni pe talange to taha ko na ne ta ia ko e lavea hono ulu pe ko mau pe ko Bruce ko ya I hono mata ko ui na me whakasesere u whakawhatapu pe ne hanga ia tā hono ulu I he mea whakauri ko ia mea lele o ne pehe ai na o neongo I au pito na hoko fo I whakamatala ko ia ke ne hanga underestimate ai capability ai whiwhine ko ui ke ne whakamatala to tone ne to ni ihia to lahi a kakaya ne nau tui nau tol ke whakamatala ko ia ke whamatala ko ia. Ka maho inga pito ko taimi ko tau whahoko ai hano lipoti e media ai ngahi whamamahi api ke tau toi tō kanga pe ko uhi na ahoko ia ko ha mea ke toi uesia ai e tō taha ko ia o ku mamahi. Ka te tau hoko atu.
Founder of One Mom's Battle, who will share her story and how she utilized social media and a grassroots campaign to bring about change. Welcome, Tina.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon. It is truly an honor to be here today. I am here as a survivor of both domestic violence and post-separation abuse, but I'm also here as an advocate dedicated to raising awareness on the crisis in the family court system. So I will share my personal story of how I protected my children while acting as my own attorney. My case started in August of 2009 as a victim of severe financial abuse. I could not afford an attorney. A lot of people have asked me, why didn't you hire an attorney? As if that was an option for me. It was not. I typed my first court declarations from a women's shelter where I had fled early one morning, afraid for my life. And I was successful in securing a restraining order which granted me exclusive use of our home. But within 24 hours of leaving the shelter and returning home, he violated the order and entered the house. There were no repercussions for his violation, and I learned that I could not depend on law enforcement or the family court system to protect me. I truly do believe on the day I received my family court case number, I was also assigned my own personal terrorist. That is truly how it felt. There was a long period of time that I slept with a hammer under my pillow because I was afraid for my life. And I endured countless hearings, 2 separate trials. We were in court a total of 13 times just in 1 year alone. There were numerous CPS investigations which labeled my ex-husband as a moderate risk, but allowed my children to go back each and every weekend. Minors Council failed my daughters repeatedly. There were over a dozen interactions with law enforcement because I was utilizing all of the resources that I believed were available to me. There was a custody evaluation during the first year, but it prioritized my ex-husband's parental rights over my daughter's safety. And I saw a huge shift at year 2. Driven by sheer desperation, I spent an afternoon sitting in the courtroom. My case wasn't up to be called that day. I just didn't know what else to do, and I wanted to understand the system. And I remember the judge saying to me that day, out loud to everyone, "Swithin, you aren't on calendar. Why are you here?" And my response was, "Your Honor, I am just here to observe." That day, I will say it was life-changing. I saw things through a different lens. To the court, to the professionals, these were just business transactions and case numbers. But for me, these were my babies. And they were really little at the time, 2 and 4 years old. Nature intended for me to protect my children, and I was operating on common sense and emotion because of the nature of this topic. But both of those things are foreign and unwelcomed in the family court system. So for me, that experience of observing, it was really a time for radical acceptance and understanding the importance of strategy. So I started going to the courthouse as an observer whenever I had extra time. I started following cases that resembled mine. I would go to the computer at the courthouse and pull up various custody cases, reviewing each and every declaration, document, filing. I paid attention to case law that was referenced, or phrases or terminologies being used by attorneys. And I really became a fixture at the courthouse. It was in 2012, I asked for and received a second child custody evaluation, same agency that had conducted the first one 2 years prior, but a different evaluator. And that evaluation is what ultimately protected my kids. That evaluator investigated and validated everything I had been saying since day one. But here's the problem. Family court is the wild, wild west. You can place the same case in front of 5 different professionals or 5 different judges, and you will have 5 different outcomes. This has to change. There is no regulation, no consistency, no oversight, no accountability. But these are children's lives, and these children are the future. It is common sense to err on the side of caution when child safety is in question, but that's not what's happening in family court. And it was during our final custody hearing, the judge called my ex-husband a sociopath twice and prohibited him from any further contact with the girls. But it took 6 years for them to understand and recognize how abusive he was. That is a third of my daughter's childhood. 6 solid years of abuse and trauma that we will be unpacking for a lifetime. My story was consistent from day one. It shouldn't be this difficult to protect kids. And by all accounts, I am considered one of the lucky ones. My children are safe and they are alive. But for anyone to hear my story and label me as lucky truly does shed light on the horrors of the system. I know I am lucky. I have incredible privilege just based on my skin color alone. And the fact that these court proceedings were in my native language. The extra challenges faced by those in marginalized communities needs to be highlighted and amplified. So once my daughters were safe, I decided, or I organically started an advocacy journey. I have spent a decade in the trenches helping those who follow in my footsteps to understand the system and the importance of strategy. My blog, onemomsbattle.com, has become a lifeline for people all around the world. We have 250,000 community members worldwide. So I've gone on to create the resources and the support that I wish I had during my own journey. As Senator Susan Rubio mentioned, I have been involved in legislative change, supporting bills around the country, such as Caden's Law, testifying at Senate hearings. And here in California, we worked very hard to bolster the efforts of Senator Susan Rubio and Ana Estevez to pass Pinky's Law by raising awareness and generating support. In 2020, I founded Family Court Awareness Month, and over the past few years, we have received over 300 proclamations from cities, counties, and states across the country declaring November as Family Court Awareness Month. I will leave you with this. There is a misconception about cases labeled high conflict. This label implies that two parties are in conflict, but that is rarely the case. It is typically a survivor fighting to protect children from an abuser. Domestic violence is about power and control. The abuser's need for control does not dissipate when the relationship ends. And many, including myself, discover that post-separation abuse is more painful than the abuse inflicted during the relationship. I want to express gratitude to the journalists who are here today, because over the past 14 years, I have seen a reluctance from journalists to cover family court stories. It's brushed off as a private family matter or a complex topic, but it's really not. It's quite simple. Post-separation abuse is an extension of domestic abuse, and the family court system becomes the abuser's playground. We're in a court system that lacks the basic training and understanding of domestic violence, and our children are being placed in grave danger. We have a crisis, and it's called family court. With November being Family Court Awareness Month, this is an opportune time for each of you to shine a spotlight on these issues. So thank you very much for having me here today.
Ko lea ko ia ka nanga ko ni o kuni lave ai ke tono no ko ia ai lao pe mo family law I Americani ko hi ko ia na fo mo ia fa ngata o domestic violence pe I daim tau pe na ne fe nga honolele ta ha ke ne ako fe ka aki pe mo family law a ke fo nga ko ia alo print mai ngai pepa ngai case a hono fighting ngai custody and fa now aya na ne fe nga honolele ta o pe alu ke fa mau anga pe talang he fa mau anga ke ai pe ko unga ko ke ia ko no a hopo na ne talang fi ha pe ke observe ka to a ene fa matala ko ene fe nga ke highlight ai maho inga ko ia ke tau ilo te ke educate ki tau tol fe ka aki mo ngai founga o family law pe ko lao ko ia ki ngai family founga ko ia fa hoko aki ngai fa mau a e fa mau anga mo ngai me pe Kaniongo ia na ne fotu a ene non-profit organization pe ko ka ta ko ni o ku toko nia ke si ngai fa e o ku esia ki na to le feli e a fa mamahi I api pe I time ta o ku ne pe foki o ku a mahu inga au pito ko mahinani ko mahina ia o lao Porque imagina ya o kutokanga kina makehe ai family law I American pe agune fra am ke hoko imagina ni ko mea ke tau to ya ko ai ke to lahiang e tau ilo fegawaki mo ngai founga o ku ngawe aki family law ki he kakai o ku wesia e he fatamak e famamahi I api.
Organic, but it's been over a decade, so it has grown a lot.
Thank you. There are a few questions for you in the chat. If you could please address those, that would be terrific. Renee Barbie's question, Henrietta Burrow's question, etc. Thank you again for joining us, Tina.
Absolutely. So did you want me to type chat into the
Yeah, if you could just
perfect.
Yes.
I will do. All right, thank you.
Thank you. And so now we move on to a familiar face for many of us, reporter Vijay Sundaram, who over a 4-decade career has done some of the most insightful reporting on domestic violence. Vijay will discuss California's new coercive control law, Welcome, VG. VG?
Yeah. Thank you, Sunita, and thank you, Sandy, for having me on this very important media briefing. I am usually not a very good public speaker, but when it comes to domestic violence, I don't know where I get the courage from. So what I want to talk about firstly, an incident that I experienced when I was a reporter with India West about 2 decades ago, or maybe not that long ago, but in any case, one gentleman one day walked into the newsroom. He said he was from Pakistan. He had heard about my activism, and would I please run a story about his daughter? And I said, what is the story about? And he said, she got married in an arranged marriage, which he arranged while she was in Pakistan. And the guy who came from him, he was from the US, originally of Pakistan descent. He told them that he was a software engineer making oodles of money. And so he would be able to provide her with a good, comfortable life. And this woman agreed. I'm going to use her name, first name. In fact, I wrote a story about her later. So he said, when she came here, she found out that he had a very low-paying job in Silicon Valley, but what he was doing was he was making porn movies and making money out of that. And so within a few weeks after they got married, this woman, Mariam, noticed one woman after another trickling into the home, and he was making the movies in the home. And when one day he ran out of subjects, so he asked Mariam, will you participate in one of the movies? And she was shocked and she said no. And in any event, she was desperate to get out of the marriage because she couldn't take it anymore. She just felt it was wrong. Then she thought if she had a child, everything will be better. So she had a baby, a daughter. When the girl was about 2 years old, or even less, I'm not exactly sure, but he came to her once again. He came to his wife, Mariam, and said, you must participate in one of these movies, documentaries. And so she said, I'm not going to do it. And so he said, if you don't do it, I'm going to have our daughter do it. He's going to use her to make a movie, porn movie. That was the last straw. And Mariam, when the husband was out of the house one day, she grabbed the child, grabbed a passport, grabbed whatever money she could lay her hands on, and fled the home and went to Chicago where her brother was. Her brother immediately called the husband and said, my sister is not coming back to your house. This cannot happen. We cannot allow this to happen. She's leaving for Pakistan tonight. And the brother bought her a ticket and she went to Pakistan. And while there, she was in touch with the husband, not to ask him to take her back, but just to keep him posted about what was happening in her life. And he was very well aware that the wife and child were safe, but he chose to file a missing persons report. So Mariam immediately became a fugitive from justice. And for the next 3 years, she got herself a job with British Airways as a flight attendant. For the next 3 years, she was in constant fear that she would be arrested wherever she landed, whichever country she was in. Any case, then that is when the father came over to the office and said, could you run a story? And I said, I can't run it just on what you said. I need more documents. She said, yeah, the DA has got all the documents. The DA wants to arrest her. That's why she's now become a fugitive from justice. I will provide you all the documents. So first thing I did was, after reading the documents, I called up the husband and said, look, I want to come and talk to you. are you willing to be interviewed? He first was shocked, quiet, and then he said, sure, come to my house, I'll interview me. And I went there and I talked to him, and he pretended that he was desperately, he was very lonely and wanted the child back. In any case, what happened, I contacted Narika, the support group for battered women in the Bay Area. They hired an attorney who was so very nice. He said, I can do it for you for about $400, which is unheard of. No attorney will take on a case for this amount. In any case, to cut a long story short, Dan Mayfield, that was the name of the lawyer. I spoke to him even yesterday to make sure he remembers all this. And he said, I remember the case. I'm so glad we were able to help us. So he was able to prove from all the telephone bills that Miriam had been in constant touch with this guy. The DA did a shoddy job in keeping track. The DA could have easily found this out without us seeking an attorney. But so within a couple of months, Dan Mayfield was able to clear Mariam's name, and she was a free person. She could that thing about she was removed from the missing persons list, and right now she's remarried and quite happy. This is what she was going through, clearly a case of coercive control, and she didn't know it because she wasn't beaten up by this guy, but just harassed to the point of, sometimes she considered ending her life, but she had a baby. So she, if we had this is years ago, if only Senator Rubio's bill was there and she was aware of it, she could have probably sought relief through the courts or some other means instead of having to flee to Pakistan. But I think that is an amazing bill which Senator Rubio introduced. And she's also introduced other bills where coercive control is emphasized. But the sad part is not all judges know about the coercive control law. Even today, they are still, not believing women who come there, even though they come with evidence. The one judge said, how can I believe you? You had a child with this guy, which is crazy for a judge to say that. So she lost custody. She didn't get what she wanted from court, but judges have to be educated. And that is why Senator Rubio's Picky's Law bill, which was just signed 3 weeks ago by the governor, will help if the judges are forced to. You can't force judges, but if the judges only decide to educate themselves on the nuances of domestic violence. Thank you. I'll take questions if you like.
Absolutely. Vijay, there are a number of questions for you, but I wanted to ask you, first of all, if you could give us a brief description of what coercive control is, and is California the only state to have such a law?
So coercive control widens the definition of domestic violence. Earlier, people thought coercive domestic violence was when the partner beat not necessarily the wife, one partner beat up the other, and that resulted in maybe a black eye or broken bones. But Rubio's bill redefined coercive control, expanded the definition, and right now, under her bill, coercive control can include financial abuse, emotional abuse, anything. It doesn't have to be. It can be, emotional abuse over a period of time. And the person does not have to come with documents to show that she had been physically abused. So that's what coercive control is.
Understood. And is California the only state to have such a law?
California was the second state in the nation after Hawaii to introduce the bill, a coercive control law. And now there are 5 states, I believe, which have passed such similar laws, Connecticut included. I think Connecticut had its bill shortly after California did. There are 5 states in the nation which have coercive control laws, and many states are now introducing their own bills.
Interesting. Henrietta has a very good question for you. Henrietta. She may not.
No, I finally.
Oh, there you are.
I finally unmuted. Thanks so much. So, Viji, how could you possibly have set up an interview to see this man by yourself, considering the business he was doing in his home? Did you tell people you were going to his house?
Yeah, I did. I was terrified, actually. I thought about it many times. Should I be taking this risk? Because this guy had no limits to whom he was asking. He asked the mail woman one day if she would come in for a little while and do the documentary, and she could continue her job. So I did one. I told my friends, I'm going to this place. I gave them the address, and I said, in case I don't come back, come there. Yes, I was scared.
Thank you.
So before I go to Tina and Viji for their 1-minute sound bites, I would like Gloria Angeles to share her story, and then ask Elena to share live the comments that she made in the chat. So Gloria.
Ko tui pe ko e talanoa ko ni tau whanongo ki ai o kutokone au pito ke te tau tau ke tau toe whakatoka ngā ia e mahu inga ko ia ke tau lipoti ha whahinga domestic violence pe o kuhoko pe ko whamamahi I api o kuhoko ke te kita. O kua pe whoke whamamahi I api ki he financial violence aia ko kei te o mahi a te paanga pe ko ngahi whakamea te whamamahi ka kita whekau aku mo paanga o kau whoki mo emotional violence, domestic violence aia ko hono whamamahi I pe hotoloto o kita. Aia ko ngahi uhinga ia o ku whakahoko ai polo kalama ko ni hoi kumai ka inga ko uhi ke tau, let's break the silence. Ka pau o ku ke whiao pe mo whakamamahi I api I whahinga fo ngā pe emotional, financial, whamamahi I koe kai o ato basic needs, hangai koe mea tokoni, mo ngai mea koe ia, o ku kau kotoa ia I he whakamamahi I api, pe koe domestic violence, pe au whia mao ia ke lipoti. Koe ngatanga pe e tau porokalama koe ia maa ki tau tolu I he whia whini, whatawange pe ne ongo lele ia tuia kia ki mo tolu kotoa I he pahinga le te o Vake Tali Folau. Whatawange mo mau hai whia whilele I he whia whini, tāna kia ngahiwi maha malolo lelei, ke tāna kia ngahiwi te ria ai ngahi ngā aue kuhanga naki mai a pongpongina. Whawheki mo tolu ke polokalama hoko, aia koe polokalama ia ai kāinga koe ia me vai ko puna, pe ko pea, I he hoko ai tahataha. Tuk pe ko ka koe whaasinga tau polokalama, ko au Emery Tofu pe me San Francisco, California.